Lawyers. What's a courtroom moment where the other side instantly regretted speaking? An outraged voice cut through the silence in the courtroom, making everyone's head whip around in alarm. "Your Honor," Adam Mitchell practically roared, slamming his hand on the polished wooden table. "We've just discovered that the plaintiff has been forging documents to bolster her case. We have proof. If you'll allow me, I'll present it right now." Lisa Caldwell sat at her counsel's table, her throat tight, her palms cold despite the buzz of adrenaline in her veins. She could feel the eyes of the entire court, an almost physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. It was not simply her career on the line. This moment represented years of struggle, countless sleepless nights, and an unyielding desire to unearth the truth. For an instant, she allowed herself a single, measured breath. She could not afford to look unsettled, not with everything at stake. Judge Ramirez's voice rose in the hush, steady and calm, though there was an undercurrent of tension that could not be mistaken. "Mr. Mitchell, you will have your turn to present evidence. But let me remind you and all counsel here, this is my court. We will not have outbursts or theatrics. Please continue in an orderly manner." Lisa's pulse pounded in her ears. She was acutely aware of how precarious her position was. If Adam Mitchell indeed had something that could discredit her evidence or her client, the entire case might collapse. But she had to hold on to the facts, onto every carefully assembled piece of documentation she and her mentor, Mark Wallace, had worked on. She swallowed hard, made herself meet Adam's glare head-on. "Your Honor," she said, her voice controlled, "I'm eager to see what so-called proof the opposing counsel has. Because I can assure you we have been meticulous, and there is absolutely no forgery in our documents." Her words hung in the air as Adam, still brimming with self-righteous fury, gathered a stack of papers. A wave of uneasy murmurs flowed through the spectators. The tension was thick enough to taste. From the corner of her eye, Lisa caught a glimpse of the tall, broad-shouldered figure of Robert Mitchell, Adam's father, who was seated behind the defense table. Robert was the real power behind everything that had brought them here. His presence radiated a sense of control, a chilling arrogance that seemed to say no one had ever bested him, and no one ever would. Lisa's thoughts flickered back to the events that had led her here, to this standoff in front of Judge Ramirez. She remembered standing in Mark Wallace's office on a humid afternoon nearly a year ago. The sunlight fell across the old wooden floor in long, dusty rays, and legal briefs were sprawled across his desk. "Lisa," Mark had said, his voice betraying the weight of the revelation he was about to share, "I have a case that's more complicated than anything you've handled so far." She had picked up the folder with a sense of curiosity, not knowing just how entangled her life would become. When she opened it, the pages told her a story of corruption, illegal land transfers, and massive sums of money funneling into untraceable shell companies. Real estate deals, hush payments. It read like a blueprint of how to manipulate entire communities. Then she spotted a name she'd never forget, Mitchell Enterprises. She remembered how a cold dread had washed over her, even though she was just beginning to see the bigger picture. Mitchell Enterprises, the same entity that had once purchased land adjacent to her grandmother's home, forcing an entire block of families to relocate under circumstances that had always seemed questionable at best. She had been too young to intervene then. Now, confronted with the possibility of exposing those old injustices, she realized she had an opportunity, maybe even an obligation, to set things right. Mark had watched her carefully. "I know about your history with them, Lisa," he said gently. "If it's too personal, you can decline. But I believe you're the perfect one for this fight. You're relentless, and you won't bend." She met his gaze. "I won't decline. If the Mitchells have been doing this for years, then it's time someone held them accountable." Now, months later, it all came down to this crucial moment in the courthouse, where Adam was insisting he had proof of wrongdoing from her side. She found it almost laughable, but beneath that fleeting amusement was a coil of anxiety, because she knew how far the Mitchell family would go to maintain their empire. Their resources were virtually unlimited, their influence unrivaled. Her own investigation had uncovered how deeply Robert Mitchell's tentacles reached into city councils, local banks, even some corners of law enforcement. The Mitchell name had both a philanthropic glow to the public, thanks to sizable donations to various charities, and an ominous ring behind closed doors where unscrupulous deals were made. Lisa had seen glimpses of that world in the files Mark had first handed her, but it wasn't until she started unearthing real evidence that she realized how dangerous going against them could be. Back in the courtroom, Adam's newly introduced paperwork was handed to the bailiff. Tension pressed on Lisa's chest. She reminded herself of every piece of diligence they had done, every hour spent verifying each signature, cross-checking each record. She doubted there was truly anything to find, yet Adam's performance hinted they had something cunning prepared. She steeled herself, quietly thinking, if there's a setup, we'll expose it. Suddenly, time seemed to stretch. She recalled all the times her mother had told her about the day their neighborhood was bought out from under them. Her mother had wept as she'd recounted how the developer had arrived with city officials, presenting them with final notices, telling them that they had 6 weeks to vacate properties that had been in their families for decades. No one had believed it was legal, but by the time they realized the fight they were in, the deals were sealed. Lisa had never forgotten that sense of powerless fury. But that was then. Now, she had the law at her disposal. She had the chance to stand up not just for her own personal sense of justice, but for an entire roster of plaintiffs who had been edged off their property under suspicious circumstances. Her heart pounded as she wondered if the scheme Adam was about to reveal was just another push to break her resolve. Counsel, is this all the evidence you wish to admit? Judge Ramirez's words pulled her back to the present. Adam nodded solemnly, though Lisa didn't miss the slight smirk dancing at the corner of his mouth. Yes, Your Honor. This shows inconsistencies that we believe prove the plaintiff's side, fabricated portions of the survey data that allegedly indicate wrongdoing by Mitchell Enterprises. Lisa stood. We object to the relevance and authenticity of these documents, she said. None of them were disclosed previously in discovery. We believe this might be a stunt to delay proceedings. The judge gazed at Adam. Mr. Mitchell, you know the rules of disclosure. If these documents are new, you must explain why they were not produced before. Adam shook his head with theatrical regret. Your Honor, we only came into possession of them this morning. We acted as quickly as we could. A weary sigh escaped Judge Ramirez's lips. Let me see them. As the judge pored over the pages, Lisa could feel her pulse in her temples. She dared to glance at Robert Mitchell again. He sat with his impeccable suit, posture rigid, eyes fixed on the judge. She couldn't help but wonder if Robert was mentally calculating how many more steps it would take to neutralize any potential threat. He had orchestrated entire construction projects that had steamrolled minority neighborhoods. Lisa's own grandmother had spoken of him like a malignant shadow, always just out of reach but controlling everything. The entire building felt charged with that, whether or not the spectators were fully aware of it. Then Mark Wallace, slightly disheveled from a night spent poring over reams of spreadsheets, leaned over and whispered, They're bluffing, or they're forging something themselves. Don't panic. The corners of Lisa's lips twitched in a reassuring half-smile. Mark had been her backbone ever since she started at the firm. When her determination slid too far into recklessness, he'd calm her. When her fear threatened to overshadow her courage, he would give her a measured pep talk. She could not imagine facing the Mitchells without him by her side. Before Judge Ramirez could speak, the scene froze in Lisa's mind, taking her back to her earliest meeting with the clients who had come to her for help. They were ordinary people. Teachers, small business owners, retirees, all had discovered that the titles to their properties had been challenged or surreptitiously transferred to a holding company. In each instance, the paper trail led to some entity with a name that changed from one city block to another, but it was all tied back to Mitchell Enterprises. One woman had cried in Lisa's office begging for justice. Her home was about to be demolished for a luxury condo she had never heard of until the day she was told she had to leave. Lisa had felt the same rage she recalled from her childhood, the sense that monstrous corporate machines could toy with people's lives as if they were inconsequential. That fury forged her resolve, and she dug into every record, every transaction, determined to piece together the Mitchell Empire's method. The deeper she went, the more horrifying it all became. Developers used shell companies to hide their real identity and pay city officials under the table to expedite construction permits. People's entire life savings were swallowed up when they lost real estate they had never planned to sell. The Mitchell name loomed everywhere, but they were always distant enough to deny direct involvement. So Lisa had prepared meticulously, collecting not only official land records but also personal stories, building an ironclad argument. Mitchell Enterprises had systematically targeted neighborhoods where they could bribe public officials, force people out, and flip properties at astronomical profits. Yet here she was, the Mitchells standing tall on the other side, claiming that she had falsified the data. Judge Ramirez set the documents down. The hush in the courtroom felt like an approaching storm. I will allow this evidence to be presented, but with the understanding that its origin and credibility will need to be fully established, she said. Turning to Lisa, she added, Ms. Caldwell, I hope you are prepared to challenge these claims. Mr. Mitchell, be advised that if you cannot prove the authenticity of these documents, there will be consequences. Yes, Your Honor, Adam replied, his tone carefully respectful. Lisa inhaled, forcing her heartbeat to settle. We have nothing to hide, Your Honor. In fact, we'd like to cross-examine the witness who supposedly provided this evidence. Adam cocked an eyebrow. Oh, we'll get to that soon enough, he said, a thin edge of threat in his tone. Lisa's mind spun with theories. Could it be a real witness who had been coerced by the Mitchells? Or was this simply an attempt to bring in a false affidavit? In that moment, she remembered an earlier tip from a contact. Robert Mitchell's personal accountant from years ago had run off after discovering something damning about the company's finances. Lisa and Mark had tried to track him down, but he'd vanished without a trace. A small seed of hope sprouted in Lisa. Maybe, just maybe, that accountant would resurface and blow the Mitchell case apart. The day's proceedings were adjourned shortly after. Lisa found herself stepping outside into the sweltering heat, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. Mark caught up to, let's not worry too much about their theatrics. They're cornered, or they wouldn't be pulling this kind of stunt. She nodded, though she couldn't fully chase away the dread. If they're cornered, that might make them even more dangerous. He placed a hand on her shoulder. You always look at the worst-case scenario, Lisa, but this time you might be right. We have to be careful. In the courthouse corridor, she spotted Adam Mitchell standing next to his father. The older man was leaning in, whispering something in Adam's ear, and Adam nodded. Lisa had the intense feeling she was being watched. Their eyes met, and Robert Mitchell gave her a small, tight-lipped smile. It was anything but friendly. She thought of the stack of depositions on her desk, and all the late nights analyzing financial statements line by line. She'd found that the Mitchells had used at least 4 separate shell corporations just in the last year. City officials had waved through zoning changes in suspiciously short timeframes. Public records that might have slowed them down had somehow disappeared. But she believed in the system, in checks and balances. She believed if she brought enough evidence, she could finally make a difference. Just then, her phone rang. She recognized the number. It was Tasha Williams, a local homeowner whose story formed part of Lisa's lawsuit. Tasha had been fighting the demolition of her family's old Victorian house. Lisa stepped aside, answering in a low voice. Tasha sounded panicked. Lisa, there are men outside with equipment. They're saying they have a permit to start tearing down my house. But we haven't even finished in court. Lisa's heart lurched. Tasha, listen to me. They can't legally do anything while this case is ongoing. Don't let them in. Call the police if they try to force their way onto your property. I'm on my way. As soon as she hung up, Mark gave her a concerned look. What happened? They're at Tasha's. Trying to start demolition. But that's blatantly illegal, he said, outraged. It's also their way of telling us they're not waiting around to see if we win the case. She walked out of the courthouse, the dusty heat smacking her in the face. Adam and Robert Mitchell were a few steps behind, but she refused to acknowledge them. All that mattered was preventing Tasha's house from being destroyed before they could secure a court. When Lisa and Mark arrived at Tasha's property, they found a construction crew milling about with heavy machinery. Lisa flashed her ID and declared that there was an active court case challenging the validity of the title transfer. The site supervisor tried to brush her off, but Mark Wallace, cool and commanding, threatened legal action on the spot. Eventually, the crew backed down, making phone calls to confirm their instructions, and within an hour, they left. Tasha's relief was visible in her tear-filled eyes, but Lisa could see the cracks in the woman's composure. The stress was taking a brutal toll on all these homeowners. That evening, Lisa holed up in her tiny apartment, flipping through her trial notes for the umpteenth time. The date for final arguments was fast approaching, and she suspected the Mitchells would try more last-minute bombshells. She only hoped that any surprise they unleashed wouldn't derail the entire case. The next morning, as she entered the law office, she found Mark waiting for her, looking grim. Lisa, I just got a call from an unknown number. The person said he's the accountant who used to work for Robert Mitchell. The one we've been looking for? Her stomach flipped. You're kidding. After all this time? He wouldn't give his name, just said he was the missing piece of the puzzle. Claims to have documents that blow the Mitchell operation wide open. Offshore accounts, fabricated expense logs, bribe ledgers. He wants to meet tonight. Where? He said to come alone to a diner off the old highway. 9 p.m. That sounds like a trap, Lisa. But we have to take the chance, don't we? Mark nodded solemnly. We do. But we'll be careful. I'll come with you and stay in my car nearby. If this is real, it could be the key to burying the Mitchells once and for all. If it's a setup, well, let's hope it's not. All day Lisa felt on edge, half expecting something else to go wrong. She went over the documents that Adam Mitchell had dumped in court, scanning them for telltale signs of forgery. She noticed small inconsistencies. Text alignment looked slightly off. Some of the land parcel numbers didn't match the official registry. It seemed like the Mitchells had doctored old city surveys to claim Lisa's side, had made false additions. It was so brazen that she knew they must have high confidence in their ability to manipulate data. Yet she also knew that if she could prove their documents were falsified, It would unravel their claim. By nightfall, she drove with Mark out to the diner. The neon sign buzzed overhead, flickering in pinks and greens. The parking lot was mostly empty. She made sure Mark parked within sight. Stepping inside, she felt a tingling awareness of every person in the small space. A tired waitress, an older man reading a newspaper in a corner booth, a couple of truckers at the counter. Then, from one of the back booths, a man in a baseball cap and dark jacket raised his hand. Lisa approached cautiously. He looked haggard, with deep lines under his eyes and a jittery, restless energy. She slid into the booth. He spoke in a low, guarded tone. "You don't know me, but I know plenty about Mitchell Enterprises. I did their books for 7 years. Let's just say I realized what I was a part of and couldn't stomach it any. They tried to silence me, so I ran. I've been off the grid, but I've also been collecting. I kept copies of everything. Paper documents, digital backups, you name it." Lisa's throat constricted. "That's exactly what we've been looking for. Proof that the Mitchells systematically defrauded families out of their land, right?" He nodded. "They not only took the land, they laundered profits, bribed city officials, and even set up threats and intimidation. Robert Mitchell runs the show. His son Adam is the willing accomplice. Look," he slipped a small USB drive across the table. "This has hundreds of files. Bank transfers, shell company registrations, email chains where they talk about pushing undesirable owners out. It's worse than you realize." Lisa took the drive with trembling hands, her heart hammering. "Why come forward now?" He closed his eyes. "Guilt, and they found me again. They've been sending men to sniff around. I don't want to look over my shoulder the rest of my life. You can protect me, right? Witness protection or something?" She placed her hand on his forearm. "We'll do everything we can. If your testimony is as strong as you say it is, we can request protective measures from the court." He glanced toward the window nervously. "I can't stay long. This is all I can give. But it should be enough to bury them." She forced a grateful smile. "Thank you. I promise I'll do all I can to keep you safe." He stood and hurried out. She let out a shaky breath. Through the diner's front glass, she saw him slip into an old sedan and drive away. Mark entered a moment later, sliding into the booth, scanning the USB drive in Lisa's hand. Was that for real? Lisa explained everything, her words tumbling out in barely contained excitement. "This might be it, Mark. Evidence that's so damning it erases all doubt. The Mitchells can't wriggle free if these documents are legitimate." They decided not to wait until morning. Returning to the office, they plugged the drive into a secure computer. The labyrinth of files that emerged was staggering. Scans of checks, wire transfers, internal memos, spreadsheets showing property acquisitions that corresponded exactly to the addresses in Lisa's lawsuit. A trove of data connecting Robert Mitchell directly to all the puppet companies. Lisa's eyes brimmed with tears of relief. "He's telling the truth, Mark. This is everything. Adam Mitchell can't talk his way out of this." Mark looked amazed. "We have to verify each item, but from a cursory glance, this is the most damning evidence I've ever seen. By the time we introduce it in court, the Mitchells will have nowhere to hide. Unless they do something drastic," Lisa said softly, a knot of foreboding growing in her stomach. The next days were a blur. Lisa, Mark, and their legal team worked non-stop to authenticate the files. They carefully prepared to submit them into evidence, mindful of the rules of disclosure. With the final arguments approaching, they planned a strategy that would systematically lay out the Mitchells' wrongdoing. However, the Mitchell side wasn't idle. The night before the hearing, Lisa discovered her car's tires slashed, a grim reminder that Robert Mitchell's threats weren't empty. Luckily, she'd anticipated retaliation and had backups for everything, plus extra security around her apartment. At last, the day arrived. The courtroom was packed. Other homeowners, media, curious onlookers. Lisa felt the weight of all the eyes upon her. She reminded herself that the truth was on her side. Judge Ramirez presided, her expression gravely serious. Adam and Robert Mitchell sat at the defense table, exuding confidence that felt manufactured. It started with Adam once again proclaiming, in fervent tones, that Lisa had fabricated her evidence. He cited the documents he had introduced previously, pointing out alleged discrepancies and calling her entire case a sham. Lisa stayed quiet, allowing him to lay out his argument. She watched him pace in front of the jury box, gesturing dramatic. He was so certain of his victory, so sure that no one could catch him. When Adam was done, Lisa stood calm. "Your Honor, I have new and compelling evidence which has been submitted through the proper channels. If you'll allow me, I'll present it now." Adam's face tightened as she began. She produced select documents from the massive trove, carefully explaining how each connected to the next, detailing land transfers, shell companies, and crucially, the involvement of Robert Mitchell in orchestrating every illegal deal. She introduced the wire transfer logs, the bribe ledgers, the emails that left no doubt as to the Mitchells' intentions. At every turn, Adam objected. But Judge Ramirez allowed most of the exhibits, citing their strong prima facie authenticity. The air in the room was electric. Reporters scribbled furiously. The crowd murmured in growing astonishment as Lisa unveiled layer after layer of corruption. Robert Mitchell's face was stony, but Lisa could see a vein throbbing in his temple. Finally, she called the star witness, the accountant himself. He walked in wearing a neat suit, looking more collected than at the diner. Still, Lisa noticed a quiver in his voice as he took the stand. He described his years working for Mitchell Enterprises, how he had discovered illegal entries in the corporate books, and how Robert Mitchell personally instructed him to hide money in offshore accounts. Adam's cross-examination was fierce. He tried to discredit the accountant, painting him as a disgruntled employee. But the accountant stuck to his story, referencing specific memos and backing up every detail with the files. Every passing minute hammered another nail into the Mitchell defense. Lisa saw Adam's confidence begin to crack. He tried to regain control by discrediting the chain of custody, but the accountant attested that he had kept those records safe for years, afraid for his life, until he found the courage to contact Lisa's firm. Every attempt to cast doubt only highlighted the consistency in the witness's testimony. When it was finally Adam's turn to respond, he launched into a Hail Mary speech that was meant to sway the judge and the public. "This witness is lying to save his own skin," Adam insisted, voice shaking with indignation. "My father is a respected philanthropist, a pillar of this city. These so-called revelations are malicious fabrications intended to smear our family name and steal our legitimate business." He paused, glancing toward Robert, who remained stone-faced. Then Adam tried a different tactic. "And as for those questionable land surveys you introduced, Ms. Caldwell, you never accounted for the date discrepancies, did you?" He swept a triumphant gaze around the courtroom. "When you filed them, you used a date that precedes certain city records by nearly 6 months. You effectively claim we had knowledge of a property purchase before it was even on the market. That's impossible. It proves you doctored the timelines yourself." Lisa's heart stuttered. She and her team had triple-checked every date. Where was this coming from? Then she spotted a minuscule detail in the documents Adam had just waved before the courtroom, a date that corresponded to an email chain. Realization dawned on her. It was an email chain from the stolen trove that actually proved the Mitchells had indeed known about the property well ahead of public listing because they were bribing city officials for insider information. By brandishing that date so confident, Adam was inadvertently confirming that the Mitchells had privileged knowledge they were never supposed to have. The judge noticed it too. Lisa could see the flicker in Judge Ramirez's eyes. Lisa rose. "I'm glad Mr. Mitchell brought that up," she said, her voice steady. "Because if you compare the date on that email to the official city record, you'll see the city record was altered to hide the real date of the listing. And here, in Mr. Mitchell's own exhibit, it clearly shows a conversation about that property 6 months before it went on the market. The only way you or your father could have had that information at the time was through illegal collusion with the Planning Commission. So thank you for confirming that the email chain is authentic." Adam's face went pale as the import of his words sank in. The courtroom broke into a storm of murmurs. The judge rapped her gavel to restore order. "You just admitted you had knowledge of the sale date months before it was public," Lisa pressed, her voice echoing in the now silent room. "Which means you effectively confirmed the authenticity of the chain of emails you previously called fabricated. That, Mr. Mitchell, is the definition of contradicting your own defense." Adam's mouth hung open. He glanced at his father, who had finally lost his composure, cheeks flushed with anger. Adam tried to backtrack, stammering, No, that's not, you're twisting," but the damage was done. Everyone could see it. He had walked right into the trap he'd set for Lisa, only to reveal the Mitchells' wrongdoing. Judge Ramirez's gaze flicked between Adam and Robert Mitchell. The hush was so absolute that Lisa could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears. Finally, the judge cleared her throat. "I think I've heard enough for one day. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning, at which time we will deliberate on the final ruling. The defense should be prepared to offer an explanation for this discrepancy." The sound of the gavel striking echoed in the stunned air. In that moment, Lisa spotted the look of instant regret on Adam's face. He had bragged, he had postured, and in his attempt to brandish evidence against her, he had inadvertently proven his own father's guilt. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed as Lisa tried to maneuver past a crush of microphones. Adam was nowhere to be seen. Presumably, he had slipped out a side door to avoid the media frenzy. Robert Mitchell stormed past, ignoring all questions. The tension crackled in the corridors. Mark found Lisa and gave her a genuine smile. You did it. Or rather, Adam did it. He just destroyed his own defense. She let out an unsteady laugh, her relief mingling with disbelief. It's not over yet, but this might seal the verdict. Her phone buzzed. Tasha Williams had seen the break in the news coverage and was calling to thank her. Hearing Tasha's joy, Lisa felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a courtroom game. Real people's homes, livelihoods, and futures hung in the balance. That night, Lisa tried to rest, but adrenaline had her pacing her apartment. Any number of things could still happen. She worried about the safety of the accountant who had come forward, about potential intimidation of jurors or court officials. The Mitchells had money and power, enough to try anything. But as she stood by her window, staring out at the city lights, she reminded herself that the truth was now out in the open. And once revealed, truth had a way of becoming unstoppable. The final day of trial arrived with an almost electric anticipation. The courtroom was more crowded than ever, the press benches filled to capacity. Robert Mitchell sat with his son, the tension between them almost tangible. Lisa glanced at them, recalling how Adam had once seemed unstoppable in his arrogance. Now he looked wary, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Judge Ramirez reconvened the session. Summations were to be delivered. Adam tried to salvage the situation, speaking in a clipped monotone about how he'd been misunderstood. He insisted that Lisa's side was still forging data, that the witness was lying. But the energy in his words had vanished. He stood there, effectively treading water, while the damning evidence behind him threatened to pull him under. When Lisa rose for her final argument, the hush was absolute. She spoke passionately about the plight of the homeowners, the unethical land grabs, the trail of corruption that had shattered lives. She reminded the court that the evidence showed a deliberate and long-running scheme orchestrated by Mitchell Enterprises to push out vulnerable communities. And she pointed out exactly how Adam had inadvertently authenticated key dates and documents, an error no one could ignore. After the closing statements, there was a long, tense recess. Lisa waited outside with Mark, tension radiating from every muscle in her body. Finally, they were called back in. Judge Ramirez's gaze swept over the courtroom.